The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above the nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial, a sound so familiar Chen had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. She moved through the night shift like water through a sieve, present everywhere, noticed nowhere, her scrubs the color of institutional invisibility, her badge clipped at precisely the same angle as everyone else's. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to the corridor as she pushed a crash cart toward the medication dispensary, her movements efficient, measured, the kind of competence that only shows up in charting and never in conversation. It was 11:36 p.m. on a Tuesday when she clocked in, and the night shift supervisor barely looked up from her desk. That was fine. Sarah preferred the nurses who didn't look. The ones who didn't look didn't ask questions, and Sarah's entire existence had been constructed around the principle that questions should never be asked. She settled into the rhythm of the ward like a hunter settling into a blind. Room 301, post-op hip replacement, pain management every 4 hours, monitor for DVT signs. Room 315, pneumonia, for antibiotics on the standard protocol, check vitals every 2 hours. The checklist lived in her mind with the precision of someone who had once had to remember ammunition counts and exit routes while bullets moved past her ear. Different tools. Same discipline. Her locker door opened with a rubber-lined squeak, and she pulled out her stethoscope, draping it around her neck with the kind of practiced grace that comes from muscle memory reinforced over 12 years of doing the same motion. Underneath a stack of extra scrubs, in a show box she'd labeled personal, sat a pair of combat boots. They were tan desert tan, worn at the heels, scuffed across the toes where concrete and shrapnel had left their marks. She touched the toe of one boot with her thumb, a ritual, a moment of contact with the person she used to be, then closed the locker door. The boots would stay hidden. The boots could never be explained. By midnight, Sarah had made her rounds on the surgical floor. She checked for lines with the precision of a bomb technician. She adjusted ventilator settings with the calm authority of someone who understood that machines keeping people alive required respect, not anxiety. Her hands didn't tremble. They never did. Trembling was the language of fear, and fear was the language of people who hadn't already died once and decided it wasn't worth repeating. The ER called up to report an incoming patient. Motor vehicle accident, stable vitals, heading to trauma assessment. Sarah noted it on the board and continued her rounds. This was how she survived: attention to detail, commitment to the task at hand, the kind of invisible excellence that kept patients alive but never made headlines. Room for 47 sat at the end of the corridor, its door half closed. Sarah pushed it open with the toe of her shoe and stepped inside. The paratrooper lay sedated and bandaged, his right arm wrapped in gauze, his breathing steady and mechanical courtesy of the oxygen mask. He was young, 24 or 25, maybe, with the kind of build that came from jumping out of helicopters for a living. The chart said his name was Marcus Webb. The chart said he'd suffered a training accident, a fall from a height that shouldn't have been fatal but came close enough to require 3 days of observation and close monitoring. Sarah checked his pulse at the wrist. Steady. Strong. She moved the oximeter from his left hand to his right, noting the reading, 96%, well within normal range. The monitor beside his bed beeped its quiet electronic heartbeat, each beep a confirmation that this body, at least, knew how to keep going. It was only when she was adjusting the foredrip that she noticed it. On his left forearm, wrapped partially in medical tape and the remnants of what had probably once been a military unit insignia tattoo, was a name in black ink. Chen. Just the single word, nothing else. A memorial tattooed on skin. Sarah's hand stopped moving. She looked at the name. She looked at the face of the unconscious man. She looked back at the name. There was nothing in his expression that recognized her. No muscle memory of survival, no lingering sense of someone who had carried him across 800 meters of open ground while bullets made the sound of angry wasps in the air around them. Just a sedated soldier, unaware that the nurse adjusting his foredrip was the senior chief petty officer who had once held him in her arms while both of them were trying very hard not to die. She finished her task. For secure. Vital stable. Chart updated with precise handwriting that would later be used as evidence of her competence and later still as proof of a threat that needed to be eliminated. She had learned the hard way that meticulous documentation was both a shield and a target, depending on who was looking at it. By 2:13 a.m., Sarah had moved through her entire patient roster. Each chart received the kind of attention to detail that would have made her training officers proud. Every note was specific, every observation precise, every decision documented with the clarity of someone who understood that in medicine, as in war, what was written down mattered more than what was actually true. She was just finishing her notes on the medication administration record when she heard footsteps approaching the station, the particular cadence of someone walking with purpose. Dr. Marcus Sterling appeared at the nurse's station like a weather pattern moving in from the west. He was tall, in his mid-50s, with the kind of tailored appearance that came from parents who had written checks to Ivy League institutions. His shoes looked expensive. His watch caught the fluorescent light and threw it back with the confidence of someone who had never once worried about whether a decision he made was actually ethical, only whether it could be defended if asked. He glanced at the patient roster on the desk, his eyes moving across the information with the speed of someone who wasn't actually reading. Then his gaze found Sarah, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Not yet. Just a kind of sharp assessment, the look a chess player might give to an opponent who had just moved a piece in an unexpected way. "Charting looks thorough tonight," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of compliment that was actually something else. "You have a lot of experience." Sarah looked up from her notes. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Before that? Government work. She returned her attention to the medication record she was completing. The answer was technically true. It was just true in a way that would mean nothing to anyone who tried to verify it. The government work didn't exist anymore. It had been erased, sealed, filed away in places that didn't show up on employment applications or background checks. Dr. Sterling nodded slowly, as if he was making a calculation. "Well, keep up the detail work. Meticulousness in charting is important. Really important." He picked up a patient chart, room 335, Mrs. Hernandez, post-op day 2, and reviewed it with the kind of speed that suggested he wasn't really reading it either. Then he looked back at Sarah, and his expression had settled into something harder. Something that looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's already started solving. "See you around, Chen." He disappeared down the corridor toward the physician's lounge, and Sarah felt the precise moment when she became something she had hoped to avoid. She became a threat. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what she was. Competent. Careful. Invisible. The kind of nurse who actually looked at the numbers on the charts, who caught discrepancies between what was ordered and what was actually delivered, who remembered 3 years of observations about how certain high-cost equipment was being billed to insurance companies but somehow never appeared in actual use. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred. Sarah finished her charting and made a mental note: something had changed. The invisibility was going to be harder to maintain now. But then again, maintaining the impossible had always been her specialty. By 4:22 a.m., the ward had settled into the particular quiet of the deepest part of night, the hour when hospitals held only the essential functions of keeping people alive. Sarah made her final rounds, checking vitals one last time, adjusting monitors, confirming that every patient had what they needed for the few remaining hours of darkness. In room 447, the paratrooper named Marcus Webb slept on, unaware that the name tattooed on his arm had just walked past his bed and would eventually change everything. Sarah didn't know that Dr. Sterling had already made his first phone call. She didn't know that he had used a contact at the hospital's credentialing office to ask some preliminary questions about her background. She didn't know that the walls she had built so carefully were already beginning to show the first hairline fractures, or that within 72 hours, someone would decide that a woman who noticed too much and asked too little had to go. She just finished her shift notes and went home to an apartment that contained almost nothing, where the combat boots in her locker were the most personal thing she owned, and where she sat at 5:51 a.m. with cold coffee and waited for the next night when she would return to Oak Creek Memorial and continue being invisible, at least until visibility became her only choice. The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial's pediatric ward cast everything in a flat, institutional white as Sarah rolled the blood pressure cuff toward room 447. It was 11:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night when the hospital held its breath between emergencies. The paratrooper in 447 had been sedated since his training accident 72 hours prior, a fall from 40 feet that should have killed him. His family had stationed themselves in rotating shifts around his bed, and tonight his mother sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her fingers working through a rosary. Dr. Sterling was waiting outside the room. He had the look of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end, his tailored coat catching the overhead light like a predator's eye reflecting moonlight. His cologne, something expensive that smelled like burnt cedar and entitlement, arrived before he did. "Nurse Chen." His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to discuss your medication administration from the 2100 shift." Sarah turned, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that the smallest reaction could become a weapon in the wrong hands. "Of course, doctor." The patient in 447 was due for his sedative at 20:30. "I ordered it at 20:24. He paused, letting the accusation hang. "It wasn't administered until 21:07. 37 minutes late. That's a significant deviation from protocol." What he didn't say, what only Sarah would know because she had checked the system 3 times after reading his order, was that the medication had been entered into the pharmaceutical queue at 20:24, but Sterling himself had flagged it for manual review. She had seen the hold order in the computer. She had waited for his confirmation, which he had deliberately delayed, then sent through at 20:55, 8 minutes before she pushed the drug. There was documentation of all of it, time-stamped and irreversible. The medication was administered as soon as the system released it, Sarah said quietly. "That's interesting." He smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "Because I remember approving it immediately. Perhaps your memory is as unreliable as your judgment." He raised his voice slightly, enough that the family in room 447 could hear every word. "Let's discuss this where your patient and his family can understand what kind of care they're receiving." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Sarah preceded him into the room, her spine perfectly straight, her breathing controlled. The paratrooper's mother looked up from her prayers, her face shifting from hope to confusion to something darker. "I want to be transparent about a serious concern," Sterling said, positioning himself between the bed and the door as if anchoring authority into the space itself. "This nurse administered sedation outside of proper protocol tonight. We're fortunate the patient wasn't harmed, but protocols exist for patient safety." "That's not accurate," Sarah said. The words were soft, but they cut through the room like a surgical blade through tissue. The medication was ordered at 2024. It was held in the system pending physician approval. That approval was not entered until 2055. I administered the medication at 2107, 7 minutes after approval. All of this is documented. Sterling's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected her to correct him in front of witnesses. Most people didn't. They apologized. They cried. They crumbled under the weight of institutional authority. "Your interpretation of the timeline is creative," he said, his voice dropping into a register meant to convey absolute certainty. "But what concerns me more is your general pattern of insubordination. The family deserves to know that they're being cared for by someone more interested in challenging her superiors than following instructions." The paratrooper's mother shifted forward. "Is this true? Should we request a different nurse?" "No." Sarah's voice remained level, but something had shifted in her posture. Her hands had steadied at her sides, the kind of stillness that came from having made peace with being misunderstood. Dr. Sterling delayed his approval intentionally. "The documentation exists on your medical record. You can request it at any time." Sterling left the room without another word, his jaw working as if he were chewing on something bitter. The break room was a narrow space that smelled like old coffee and the particular exhaustion of people running on their 4th consecutive night shift. Sarah sat at the plastic table with her lunch, the container of rice and vegetables she had meal prepped on Sunday, and opened it to the sound of the refrigerator's compressor humming into life. The other nurses had been laughing about something when she entered. By the time she pulled out her chair, they had begun remembering tasks. Urgent charting. A bed that needed changing in 3:12. A supply inventory that couldn't wait another minute. Within 90 seconds, she was alone. She ate slowly, methodically, the way someone eats when they're not actually tasting the food. The rice was cool now. She didn't mind. She had learned in her previous life that hot or cold mattered far less than consistency, and consistency was something she could control. By Wednesday morning, before the day shift arrived, a write-up appeared on the bulletin board in the staff room. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, her name centered at the top in bold, disciplinary notice, personnel file. The infractions were itemized with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Failure to follow direct orders regarding medication administration. Insubordination during clinical rounds. Pattern of resistance to supervisory authority. Unprofessional communication with attending physicians. Each one was meticulously worded to sound reasonable, damning, and impossible to defend without revealing the truth about what Sterling had orchestrated. Sarah read it in the break room, standing in the corner where the light was worst. She read it 3 times, her eyes moving methodically through each paragraph, her hands perfectly still. The other nurses pretended not to watch her. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand before it could fall, her eyes never leaving the paper. When she looked up, Dr. Sterling was visible through the small window in the break room door, watching her with the expression of a man who had finally gotten what he wanted. She walked to the door and opened it, her eyes meeting his directly. Up close, she could see the calculation in his face, the confidence of someone who had never lost when he played by his own rules. "Accuracy matters, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was the kind of quiet that made people lean in to hear it, the kind that suggested she was sharing something she wanted only him to know. In charts and in accusations. The hallway seemed to contract around them for a moment. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to adjust his tie, a gesture that suggested something had landed. Sarah returned to her shift, and the night continued as it always did. The monitors beeped their electronic rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical song. The hospital breathed its cold, fluorescent breath, indifferent to the small wars being fought in its corridors. She had 48 hours before the next stage of whatever Sterling was building began. 48 hours before security would be called. Before the phone calls to references that would lead nowhere. Before the state nursing board would receive a complaint from someone she had never met. Before the sealed military files, sealed on purpose, by order of the Pentagon, to protect operations still unfolding in mountains she had sworn never to speak of, would become evidence of her unsuitability. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence of her colleagues, the studied absence of anyone willing to defend her, the way the hospital had decided in the space of 3 days that a woman who noticed too much and said too little had somehow become expendable. The worst part was knowing that she couldn't fight back without surfacing, and surfacing would mean ending the lives of people she had left behind in the Hindu Kush. The worst part was sitting in the supply closet at 2:38 a.m., checking her phone, the civilian one, the one the Pentagon had told her never to use, and seeing an unread message in an encrypted application that automatically deleted itself, "We know where you are. We're coming. Hold position." Sundown. Room for 47 lay quiet at 2:13 a.m. The paratrooper, James Garrett, 23 years old, recovering from a training accident, slept under sedation, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Sarah Chen moved through her routine vitals check with the same invisible efficiency she'd perfected over 2 years of civilian work. Pulse. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation holding steady at 94%. The monitor beeped its reassuring rhythm, a metronome of stability that meant nothing was wrong, everything was fine, the night would continue as it had for 72 consecutive shifts without incident. She was adjusting the fall line when James gasped. Not the small, reflex gasp of a sleeping person. A desperate, drowning gasp. His eyes snapped open but didn't focus. His body arched off the mattress as if an invisible hand was crushing his ribs. The oxygen saturation number on the monitor flickered downward with terrifying speed. 92. 88. 84. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, stealing the space where his blood was supposed to flow. The delayed kind that waited 72 hours before it tried to kill you. Sarah's hands moved before her mind caught up. The code button was already being pressed by her fingers. Already calling downstairs. Already requesting a crash cart she wouldn't need for what she was about to do. The calm that fell over her was not something she cultivated, it was muscle memory wrapped in skin, the body remembering what the mind had spent 2 years trying to forget. Dr. Sterling arrived in 30 seconds, moving fast because he was competent at the things that didn't threaten him. Behind him came the on-call resident, a young man named Morrison, pale and moving through the motions of an emergency he'd only ever rehearsed. Neither of them saw Sarah reach for the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. Neither of them saw her locate the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her muscle memory from 1,000 field triage situations in Sangin. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space sounded like a held breath finally released. 78% saturation. 82%. 86%. Dr. Sterling blinked at the needle. At Sarah's steady hand. At the way she was reading the monitor like she was reading a map of terrain she already knew by heart. Morrison's face had gone the color of wet gauze. His hands trembled. His feet felt nailed to the floor. "We need a chest tube," Sarah said. Not a request. A statement. The kind of statement that came from someone who had already made this decision 1,000 times before. 36 French. "Prepare the kit." Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave and acquired a weight that made the fluorescent lights above seem to lean inward and listen. The timid night shift nurse who accepted insults in silence had vanished. In her place stood someone whose movements carried the terrible grace of apex predators, fluid and precise and absolutely certain. Morrison stared at her like she had spoken in a language he was hearing for the first time. "Doctor?" Sarah turned to Sterling, her eyes meeting his with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "The tube. Now." Dr. Sterling moved. He didn't ask questions. Something in her posture, the authority radiating from her like heat off asphalt, made questioning impossible. The chest tube was prepared. The tube went in. James Garrett's lungs began accepting oxygen again. The monitor climbed steadily. 90%. 92%. 95%. The rhythm steadied into something that would keep him alive until morning. Sarah stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the bed and turned to check the monitors, her face giving nothing away, her hands already moving to the next task. The crisis had passed. The patient would survive. The night would continue. But Dr. Sterling was staring at her. At her hands. At the way her eyes had swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone who had triaged casualties in places where there were no backup teams and no surgeons on standby. At the way she had known, without hesitation, that the resident would freeze. At the way she had taken command as if command was her native language and she had only been pretending to speak anything else. "Where did you learn that procedure?" Dr. Sterling's voice was steady but his eyes had narrowed. "That's not standard civilian protocol, Ms. Chen." Sarah didn't look at him. She was checking the chest tube placement, verifying the drainage, working through the post-procedure checklist with the focus of someone whose attention was already elsewhere. Critical care rotation. Field medicine elective. The lie came out smooth as silk because it was close enough to the truth to pass any test that didn't involve actually checking her civilian credential file. Which, of course, no one would. Nurses didn't have field medicine electives. Nurses didn't know emergency needle decompression without some kind of military training that didn't exist on her resume. But Dr. Sterling had seen something. Sarah could feel his eyes tracking her movements like a predator who had just caught the scent of something unexpected in familiar territory. "Get me Dr. Brennan from pulmonology," Sterling said, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. Tell her we need a full workup on this patient. Pneumothorax delayed presentation. I want to understand why the initial imaging missed this. It wasn't a medical question. It was a test. A probe. A line cast into deep water to see what might bite. Sarah continued her work. Vitals. Oxygen saturation. Ventilator settings. She moved through the checklist with the same invisible efficiency she had maintained for 72 shifts, but something had fractured. Some carefully constructed wall had developed a crack, and through that crack Dr. Sterling was beginning to see something that didn't fit the narrative of a civilian nurse with a cardiac care background. Morrison, still pale, finally found his voice. That was incredible. I froze. I would have frozen up there with the code team and he would have crashed in the stairwell, Anne. He didn't, Sarah said quietly. She still didn't look at Dr. Sterling. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his attention like hands probing for secrets she had spent 2 years burying. Monitor him every 15 minutes for the next 6 hours. If his saturation drops below 92% or if there's any increase in drainage, page me immediately. No waiting for the resident. Of course, Morrison said. He sounded young. He sounded grateful. He sounded like someone who would probably go home at the end of his shift and never think about the crack in the wall that had just appeared. Dr. Sterling, however, stood in the doorway with his phone already moving to his ear. His face had settled into the expression of a man who had just realized that the invisible threat he had been sensing for 2 weeks was not invisible at all, it was just standing 3 feet away from him, dressed in scrubs, checking drip rates like someone who knew exactly how long you had before oxygen deprivation became irreversible. I'll be following up on that credential verification, Sterling said. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just a statement of fact. A promise. A threat wrapped in administrative language. Sarah's hands paused for exactly 1 beat. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitor beeped in steady reassurance. She had just saved a man's life using the exact skills she had been told never to display, never to reference, never to let slip in front of anyone who might ask the question she couldn't answer without unraveling everything the Pentagon had ordered her to forget. Whatever you need, Doctor, she said. Her voice was calm. It was measured. It betrayed nothing except perfect professional courtesy. But Dr. Sterling had already turned and was walking toward the nurse's station, phone to his ear, his mind already running through the contacts who owed him favors. The contacts who could pull strings. The contacts who could make inquiries that would lead to sealed files and redacted documents and a trail that ended in stone walls labeled classified. He had just seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Now he had to decide what to do about it. Dr. Sterling's hands moved with practiced precision as he dialed the first number, his office door closed, the soft click of the lock a small confirmation of what was coming. He had spent 18 years building a network of favors, board members who owed him referrals, administrators whose children attended schools Sterling had helped them afford, purchasing directors who understood the unspoken language of gratitude. The Paratrooper stabilization had been a complication, yes, but Sarah Chen was the real threat. A nurse that thorough, that observant, with reflexes like that, would eventually see what he was doing. The phantom equipment orders. The triple billing. The supplies that arrived on paper but never in reality. He couldn't afford to let her look any closer. The first call went to Gerald Hutchins, chief of surgery at Duke University Medical Center, a man Sterling had guided toward a lucrative consulting contract 3 years prior. Gerald, I need a favor. No preamble. No pleasantries. I have a nurse at Oak Creek, Sarah Chen. New hire, appears qualified, but there are concerning gaps in her employment history. I need the state board to initiate an investigation into her credentials. The pause on the line told Sterling everything. Hutchins understood the architecture of the request. This wasn't about concern, this was about elimination. I'll make a call, Hutchins said, and hung up. The state nursing board, staffed by peers and colleagues Sterling had cultivated for exactly this purpose, would receive word within the hour. An urgent inquiry regarding credential verification. Red flags placed strategically in the system. The second call went to Vincent Park, a private investigator who had worked for Sterling before, digging into the lives of malpractice witnesses and uncomfortable employees. "I need you to trace someone," Sterling said, providing Sarah's name and the sparse employment history she had provided on her application. Background check, references, everything. What Sterling didn't know was that Sarah's references would lead to dead ends, a hospital in San Diego that had no record of her, a clinic in Seattle that had closed 15 years ago, a supervisor named Colonel Hayes at an address that didn't exist. The sealed military files would appear in the system like locked doors, the kind of mysterious barriers that made investigators suspicious. A person with something to hide. A person with forged credentials. A person who had lied her way into Oak Creek Memorial. Within 48 hours, the machinery Sterling had activated began to move like a vice closing. The private investigator's preliminary report landed in Sterling's inbox with damning language, unable to verify employment history. References unavailable. Possible falsification of credentials. The State Nursing Board sent an official notice to Oak Creek Memorial's compliance office requesting immediate suspension of the subject nurse pending investigation. The board members who owed Sterling called the hospital administrator, a woman named Morrison who understood that federal funding depended on regulatory cooperation. Morrison called Sterling personally. "We need her gone. Today." Security arrived at Sarah's station at 6:22 p.m., during the transition between shifts. The guard's name was Jackson, a former Marine who had worked hospital security for a decade, and his voice carried something like apology. "I'm sorry, Sarah. You need to clear your locker and leave the building. Administrative suspension pending investigation." He didn't meet her eyes. The document he handed her was dated 20 minutes before his arrival. The order had come down from the state level, it said, citing credential irregularities and potential fraud. Sarah read it with the same methodical attention she gave to every chart note, every medication order, every critical finding. The accusations were specific: falsification of employment records, misrepresentation of qualifications, administrative fraud. She couldn't defend herself. That was the precision of Sterling's strategy. Any explanation would require her to surface the truth, to name the missions, to invoke the classified operations, to prove her identity through channels that would expose assets still in the field, still in danger. She was caught in a cage of her own making, a cage built from the official order to disappear, to become someone else, to never speak the name Senior Chief Petty Officer again. To defend herself would be to betray the oath that had shaped her entire adult life. Jackson walked with her to her locker, his shoulders tight. She removed her belongings, the small stack of personal items that marked a life lived in fragments. The cracked mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" printed on it, a gift from the previous hospital, a joke from people who would never know the real distance between perfect and broken. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves curling inward like hands surrendering. A photograph of her SEAL team leader, Colonel Mercer, the man who had extracted her from Sangin and told her to forget everything she had been. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a surgical towel, the pair of worn combat boots she had carried through 3 combat deployments, boots that smelled of desert dust and gunpowder residue, boots that were impossible to explain owning without unraveling the entire fiction of Sarah Chen, RN. She placed everything in the cardboard box Jackson provided. The box was the same size as supply inventory containers, thin-walled and disposable, a receptacle for things no longer needed. She walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 7:13 p.m., past the ER entrance where she had saved that paratrooper's life 6 hours ago, past the nurse's station where colleagues avoided her eyes, into a Raleigh evening that had turned to rain. The rain fell in sheets, the kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers, that drummed against concrete and asphalt with relentless percussion. Sarah sat at the bus stop on Hillsborough Street, the cardboard box balanced on her lap, water soaking through her jacket. Her civilian credentials were in there, the ones that were real, the ones that weren't classified, the ones that meant nothing now. The apartment deposit on her checking account would cover 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she didn't eat. She could go back to the motel out on I-40, the one that charged $35 a night and asked no questions. She could disappear again, this time for real. She opened the box and looked at the photograph of Mercer, rain spilling across the laminated surface. His face was younger in this image, taken before Kandahar, before the operation that would end his right-side mobility, before he had ordered her to become invisible. The succulent had begun to wilt completely, its life sustained by a cover that was now demolished. She held the photograph for a long time, watching water blur the details of his features. The combat boots felt heavier than they should, each ounce weighted with every mission they had carried her through. She could throw them into the storm and walk away. She could finally, truly disappear. No one would connect Sarah Chen to anything. No one would remember. No one would come looking. The doubt was a physical thing, occupying the space in her chest where confidence had always lived. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had pushed too far beyond her cover. Maybe the only way to survive now was to accept the erasure, to let Sarah Chen dissolve into nothing, to become someone new again. The rain hammered down and she sat motionless, a woman holding a cardboard box at a bus stop, anonymous as weather. Then she saw it. Tucked beneath the surgical towel at the bottom of the box, barely visible in the failing light, a challenge coin. She pulled it out with trembling hands. The coin was Navy SEAL issue, the obverse showing the trident, the reverse stamped with a date and the words Sangin 2012. Mercer had given her this coin in a forward operating base, pressing it into her palm during a mission briefing and telling her, "This means you are never alone. You are never forgotten. Not as long as we breathe." Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. She held the coin until her circulation returned, until the trembling stopped, until the only sound was rain and the fluorescent hum of the bus shelter's overhead light. And then she heard it. The sound came first, not a voice, but an engine, steady and mechanical, the distinctive rhythm of a diesel turbine. Lights appeared through the rain, bright and military precise, cutting through the downpour with the kind of intensity that belonged to no civilian vehicle. A black SUV pulled to the curb in front of her, its windows tinted past opacity, the engine ticking softly as it idled. The passenger window lowered without a sound. Inside, she could see a silhouette, could see the phone being held to his ear, could see the slight nod of acknowledgement. The window rose. The SUV didn't move. Just idled there, rain streaming down its sides, waiting. She didn't move. She held the challenge coin and the cardboard box and sat very still, watching the black SUV through the rain, understanding without knowing how she understood that everything was about to change. Someone on the other end of that phone call had just asked one very specific question, "Is she there?" And someone inside that SUV had answered, "We have visual." 2 nights later, the emergency room doors at Oak Creek Memorial burst open to the sound of paramedic radios crackling codes. A man in his 40s lay on the stretcher, blood soaking through gauze wrapped around his abdomen, a grocery store parking lot stabbing that had escalated from a mugging to something far worse. His daughter, 12 years old, walked beside him with the kind of shock that comes from watching your world fracture in seconds. The attending physician began his assessment, gloved hands moving through the motions of triage, when the patient's fingers locked around the doctor's wrist with surprising strength. His voice came out fractured, urgent, barely above a whisper. "The woman. Chen. Senior Chief. Where is she?" The doctor's brow furrowed. "Sir, I need you to focus. What's your pain level?" But the man would not release him. "She saved my village. Sangin. She came through fire. She brought 17 of us out. I know this woman." His daughter stepped forward, her small voice carrying a weight that made the entire trauma bay go still. "My father says she is Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen." The room did not move. A nurse standing at the medication cart turned slowly, her hands freezing mid-motion. Another reached for the patient's chart, and within seconds, 3 pairs of eyes were scanning the file, the transfer notes, the military liaison documentation that had been flagged and filed away when Sarah Chen had been admitted to the system 6 weeks earlier. There it was. A single page, classified notation, requesting immediate contact with Naval Special Warfare Command upon any emergency requiring the patient or staff to reference the name Chen. The nurse holding the file looked up, her voice barely audible. We need to call. Now. The phone rang in the administrative corridor where Dr. Sterling had been summoned to explain the sudden reactivation of records he had been assured would remain buried. His face was already pale, already calculating, when a man in dress blues walked toward him. The uniform told a story before any words did. The insignia told another. The bearing told a third. The SEAL team leader's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Dr. Sterling. Senior Chief Chen holds the Navy Cross. 2 bronze stars with Valor. A Purple Heart. She extracted 17 civilians under fire in Sangin while you were billing Medicare for phantom supplies. The words landed like rounds. She performed emergency procedures in a combat zone with equipment held together by duct tape and determination. And you terminated her employment based on fabricated disciplinary violations. Sterling's face began to shift, a creature recognizing the moment the trap had sprung. An FBI agent stepped from the corridor's shadow, federal badge catching the fluorescent light above. His voice had the precision of a prosecutor. Dr. Sterling. We have been building a case on your procurement fraud for the past 6 months. Inflated billing for supplies never delivered. Equipment purchased at triple market value and resold back to the hospital. We have $17,000 in kickbacks traced to your personal accounts. The agent's eyes were flat, analytical. What gave us probable cause was your charting discrepancies. Your incomplete orders. Your contradictions. He paused. Senior Chief Chen's meticulous documentation proved you were lying about the timeline of medication administration. Her notes built the case that ended your career. Sterling reached for something to say, some network of board members to call, some favor to activate. His phone sat silent on the desk. Every number he dialed went to voicemail. Every ally suddenly unreachable. His face drained of color the way blood drains from a body after catastrophic trauma. Complete. Irreversible. The same security guard who had handed Sarah a cardboard box containing a cracked mug, a dying succulent, and memories she was not supposed to have walked into Sterling's office 6 hours later. He carried an identical box. His expression was professionally neutral. I believe you know the way out, sir. The box contained the nameplate from his office door, his personal effects from his desk, and severance papers stamped with the hospital's seal. Sterling took the box as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. He walked past the nursing station. Every nurse who had witnessed his bullying stood in a line that parted for him without looking up. The orderlies turned their backs. The residents who had learned medicine from him suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere. He descended the stairs alone. Alone was all he would be now. And then, 18 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the White House. The dress whites hung on her shoulders with the weight of commendations, the Navy Cross pinned at her chest, 2 bronze stars arranged in ascending order, and the Purple Heart at the final position. The president extended his hand, and when he shook hers, cameras captured the moment a woman officially recognized for service that had been buried, hidden, ordered into silence. The young paratrooper from room 447, fully recovered, stood beside her in his own dress uniform. His arm bore her name still tattooed across his forearm. Chen. He finally understood why. The ceremony concluded, and Sarah walked through the streets of Washington with her team leader at her side, both of them in whites that seemed to glow against the winter afternoon. They passed a strip mall on K Street. Through the window of a budget insurance agency, behind a folding table beneath a banner reading Affordable Insurance, a man sat with a name tag that read Steve. His hands trembled as he entered new customer data into a computer. His commission structure paid 12% of whatever policies he managed to place. His salary was $17 an hour. He looked up as a woman in navy dress whites walked past the window. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. His face went white. He reached for the phone as if to call someone, then remembered he had no one left to call. Sarah did not slow her pace. She did not acknowledge him. She simply continued forward, her boots striking the pavement with the precision of someone who had walked through far worse. The worn combat boots she had carried in that cardboard box at the bus stop, the one she could not explain owning, now sat in a climate-controlled shadow box in the White House Situation Room, mounted beside the declassified mission report detailing Operation Sangin, her name no longer redacted, her service finally honored, her sacrifice finally witnessed. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, the hospital board announced a new Veterans Affairs wing opening in the spring. Full trauma capability. Zero-cost care for any military service member. The position of Chief of Trauma was offered to Sarah Chen, her name no longer buried, her credentials no longer questioned. She accepted with one condition. She wanted to work the night shift. She wanted to check vitals at 2 in the morning. She wanted to be there when the forgotten patients arrived, when the invisible ones came through the doors thinking no one was watching. She still wore scrubs. They asked if she wanted command, an office, a title that preceded her name. She shook her head. My fight is here now. The trembling, the internal churning that had been restrained for so long, finally eased. Scars tell stories. Some are visible. Most are not. The nurses who had abandoned her in the break room now asked her for guidance on procedures. The residents who had witnessed her perform emergency decompression approached her with questions, with respect, with the understanding that they had been wrong. A young resident asked her one evening, "How did you know exactly what to do?" She was drawing up a medication, her hand steady as a surgical laser. "I have been trained for every moment of my life," she said quietly. "The question is not whether I knew. The question is why you did not." The paratrooper from room 447 appeared in the emergency room one afternoon with his daughter, both of them visiting for a checkup. He saluted Sarah. She returned it. His daughter, aged 4, asked her mother what that meant. "That means," his wife said, "that woman saved her father's life. Twice." Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? Have you ever judged someone for working a job you thought was beneath them, only to discover later they were holding something you could never understand? Sarah Chen's story is that of a warrior who chose anonymity, who served in silence, who asked for nothing but recognition of the truth. If her story resonates with you, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below with your answer to this question. Would you have walked away from that hospital, or would you have fought back? Thank you for watching.